Today we're going to learn more about working with InDesign. To do that, we're going to recreate or approximate this very simple layout that consists of a simple graphic, one logo, and the rest consists of type. So to begin, we'll launch InDesign, and we'll go to File, New, and ask for a new document, and we'll click to the Print Presets. And rather than using one of these predefined presets, we're going to change our unit of measure to inches. And we're going to request a width of 6 inches and a height of 6 inches, and click Create. The very first thing I recommend everyone does is go to the Window menu and go to the Workspace options and ensure that Essentials is checked off. And if it is, then I want you to click Reset Essentials. This ensures that all of the tools and the palettes that you see match up with what you see on your screen. The thing you'll notice when creating a new InDesign document, which is unique to InDesign, is that there's this pink line. And this pink line, it's non-printing, and it's called a margin line. This is visual reference when you're creating a layout, and largely use it as a reminder to not get too close to the edge of the page. You can change this value, but right now we'll just work with the preset value. If you take a look at the right-hand side of the document area, you'll notice we do have a layers palette here in InDesign, and it functions pretty much exactly the way you would expect it to based on your experience in Photoshop and also Illustrator. With more complicated layouts, dividing up your document into layers often makes sense, but today we'll just work on a single layer. But it's good to know that that's an option. To start our design, we'll start with a background color. In InDesign, you have to remember that everything needs to sit in a container. Areas of color, type, images, they all need their own container to sit in. We'll start off by using one of our shape containers, and we can use either the rectangular frame tool or the rectangle tool, and it doesn't matter because we can fill both with color. I'm going to use the rectangle tool, and if I click and hold, notice that I do have options for other shapes, and I'm going to click and drag starting at the top left of my document area all the way down to the bottom right to create a container for that background color to sit in. Once I've created the container, I want to create a color. There's a lot of different ways that you can change the color of a selected object. Today, we'll take a look at the top area of the window and notice that there is two icons. One represents the fill and one represents the stroke. And the first thing I want to do is I want to get rid of that stroke. So I'm going to click on the side and select None. And then I can click beside the fill icon, and then I can select a color that might already exist in my swatches palette. Or if I double click on the square that represents the fill color, it opens up the color picker, and then I can define my own color. I'm going to use sort of a deep orange color because I want both black and white text to be visible on it. So I want it to be quite deep. If you're having a hard time matching this color, you can always input the values you see here in the R, G, and B fields to match this color exactly. I'm going to click OK, and because my object was selected at the time that I created the color, it automatically gets filled in. If I was creating a number of different pages or slides or whatever it is that I'm creating here in InDesign, and I know I'm going to want to reuse this color, is click over to my swatches, and you'll see that that foreground color of this object displays here, and I'm going to add it to my swatches palette. So that way later on when I need to use it for a different element in my design, I can simply select it from swatches instead of guessing that it's kind of close to that original color I created. To do that, I click on the little options area at the top of the swatches palette, and I click New Color Swatch and click OK. Another thing I can do with colors, the colors listed in my swatches palette, is I can give them a unique name so I know what element I'm using that specific color for. And to do that, I can just double click on the color again. I can adjust it from here, and I can rename it by deselecting this Name with Color Value option. And then a field shows up, and I can call it whatever is appropriate. So I'm going to call this background color and click OK. If I'm done with my swatches palette, I can just close it up by clicking on that little arrow, and it collapses it. Now that we have our background color in place, we're ready to start adding type to our document. I'm going to minimize my InDesign file by clicking the yellow dot in the upper left corner of the screen, and I'm going to double click to open up my poster text, and we'll start off with the text that simply says 32. I'm going to copy it to my clipboard by pressing Command C, or you can go to Edit, Copy, return back to my InDesign document, and this time I'm going to select my type tool to add this text to the document. I want to make sure that this square is deselected. If it isn't, and I click with the type tool, it will transform this item into a text container, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to press Command Z. I'm going to select my Move tool, click off to the side so that isn't selected, and then I'm going to select my Type tool, T is for type, click and drag, and I'm going to create a container for this type to sit in. And then I'm going to press Paste, apply some formatting to this piece of type. I'm going to select the type so it's highlighted, and I'm going to go to my Type menu. And I want to make sure that the A option is selected. If you're not seeing the typeface name and the size and all these different options that you see on my screen, and instead you see something like this, that's because you're in the area of formatting that is concerned with paragraphs. So alignment and spacing and all sorts of technical things we don't have to worry about quite yet. So we want to click on A. We're going to go to the Type menu, and we're going to select Avenir Next Condensed. You can click and hold and scroll until you find Avenir Next Condensed. A much easier way is to just type in the first few characters of that typeface's name, and notice that your type menu automatically scrolls to those choices. You can select any one of the Avenir Next options, because as long as that Avenir Next font is selected, you can choose what weight you want to use. Avenir is really nice because it carries a bunch of different weights. You can go all the way from very, very light to very, very heavy. And for the number 32, we're going to choose heavy. And the next thing we'll do is make it larger. In order to make it larger, you can click and select a number from the preset list. But many times when we're designing, we don't know how big we want to make something. So a technique I usually use is I'll click once in the field where it says this type is 12 point right now, and I can use my up and down arrow key to increase or decrease the size, and I can see that change automatically update in my design. If I want to move faster than just 1 point increments, I can hold my Shift key and it will jump up in 10 point increments. So we're going to make it nice and big. Let's go 60 point. I'm going to select my selection tool, and that allows me to move around this type and its container in my document. It's possible that when you're working with type in InDesign, you create a container, you start to format your type, and some of it goes missing. So if my container was way too small to accommodate that large piece of type, and now I've made the container smaller, you'll notice that the type seems to disappear. You'll also notice that there's a little red cross here on the side of the type container. And that means that there's more type here in the container than we can see. So the solution is to simply increase the size of the container so you can see all of the type. One thing you usually want to avoid when you're working in InDesign is having picture boxes and text boxes that are far larger than they need to be. It makes it more difficult to click and rearrange the elements in your document. So a good habit to get into is either just manually change the size of the container by clicking and dragging so it's not any bigger than it needs to be to contain whatever it's holding, or I can right click on this active text container and I can go to the fitting menu and I can say fit frame to content, and it automatically closes it up for me. So again, that's right click, fitting, fit frame to content. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to modify the color of the type. So to do that, I'm going to double click on this text container and then press Command A to select all. Double clicking activates and Command A selects whatever's in the container. Then I'm going to go to my swatches palette again, and black should be the color that shows. It's letting you know that that type is colored with black. And instead of black, I want to work with 80% black, so it's a deep gray color. And what I'm going to do is rather than changing the tint value, which will let me make that black lighter. I want to create a new color. So I'm going to go back to my options area of my swatches palette, request a new color swatch, and here I'm going to use the slider or type in a value. And I know I want 80%, so I'm just going to type 80 in. I'm going to deselect the name with color value, and I'm going to call this text color deep gray. And I'm going to click OK. Now that's a new item in my swatches palette, which means whenever I want other type in my document or design to match, I can simply go to the swatches palette and select that color. I'm going to reselect my selection tool and click off to the side to deselect. We're ready to add more type to our document, so again, I'm going to minimize InDesign, and this time I'm selecting water saving device, edit copy or Command C, return back to InDesign, create a new text container. And when I create this new text container, I want to make sure I don't accidentally click on an existing one because that will make it active, and I want it to be a separate container. So I'm going to click above, and I'm going to make it the approximate width of the container that's already there because I want that type to sit just on top of 32. I'm going to paste, Command V to paste or edit paste. I'm going to make sure that container is selected, and I'm going to press Command A to select all. And this time I'm going to go to Avenir Next Condensed. And I'm going to select medium. And you'll notice that that line is cut off, and you'll see that red warning symbol on the edge of the text container. I'm going to make this type smaller, and I'm going to use my nudge key trick to make it smaller so it's all sitting on one line. And in the original design, this type is all caps. I certainly don't want to have to reset any of the type, so I'm going to use some of the options here in my character formatting to automatically make it all caps. This symbol here, and we have it in Illustrator, and we also have it in Photoshop, allows me to simply click, and it makes it all caps. And now that it's all caps, it's wider than it was when it was upper and lowercase. So again, I'm going to have to tweak the point size so that it's sitting all on one line. Type is going to be white. While it's still all selected, I'm going to go to my swatches palette and click paper. I'm going to reselect my move tool or my selection tool. And when I do that and it's no longer highlighted, I'm noticing that it seems very, very thin. So I'm going to double click on that text container. I'm going to press Command A. I'm going to select demi bold. And again, I've made it bolder, so it's taking up a little more space, so I need to tweak the size. I don't want to go too much smaller than 8 point, so I'm going to try 7.5. And now I'm just typing in the value that I want. And I press Enter to enter in that change, and it looks really close. I have my selection tool active, and I'm noticing that I've got a far bigger container than I need. So I'm going to right-click, Fitting, Fit Frame to Content. And then I can click and drag to move it over the number 32. You can also use your nudge keys to move it up, down, and over when you're really fighting to get that perfect alignment. So far we've been working in normal mode, and I kind of think of it as work mode, and it lets us see all the outlines of the containers we're working with and creating. We see our margins, and it's very distracting when you're trying to build a design. If we go to the bottom of the tool palette here and click and hold, there's different views available, and usually I toggle between normal and preview. And when we're in preview mode, it takes away all the edges, all the guides, other elements we might be using that aren't going to be visible in our final design. You can toggle between preview and normal mode by just pressing W on your keyboard. If you haven't saved your file yet, let's go to File, Save. We're going to choose a location for it to be saved to, and I would recommend that Intro to InDesign folder that should be on your desktop. And we're going to name it with your last name, your first initial, and we'll just call it Intro InDesign. If you're seeing a minimized version of that Save As dialog box, you can click on this little arrow next to the name and open it up, and it makes it very easy to navigate to the desktop to find where you want to save something. So there's my Intro to InDesign folder. I double click to open that and click Save. We're ready to add more type to our design, so we're going to minimize InDesign. We're going to select these two lines of text, copy to the clipboard, return to InDesign, select our type tool, click and drag to create a container, and I'm creating it in the approximate location and size that I think I'm going to need, but it's very easy to change the size of that container later. I'm going to press Command V to paste. I'm going to press Command A to select all, and reselect Avenir Condensed if it isn't already selected, and then change a different weight, and we're going to select bold. This type should also be all caps, so I'm going to click on my all caps button here in the top of the window, and then I'm going to make it larger. And then I'm going to stop here for a moment. In my design, you might notice that all of a sudden I'm starting to get a hyphen in the word minute. And because this type is going to be large and prominent, it's not like a paragraph of text that you would find in a newspaper or magazine, I want to avoid hyphenation. It just makes things look messy. The easiest way to do that for any piece of type where you want to make sure that no hyphenation occurs is to select your type and go all the way to the upper right hand corner of your window where there's another series of options. And if we click and hold, there's lots of different things here. Don't worry about all that. Just find hyphenation. And once that little dialog box opens up, we can deselect hyphenate, click OK, and now this type will never hyphenate. We'll make our type larger. And again, I'm going to use my little trick where I click in that field and use my up arrow keys to increase the size. And once I feel like it's a good size, the next thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at the leading. And leading is the amount of space between lines of text. Right now, I feel that there's just too much space between each line, and I want to tighten up the leading. To do that, I return to the top of my window. And this field over here, if I hover over that little icon, it says leading. And you'll notice it has a value of 22.8, and it's in brackets. Whenever you see a value in brackets, it means it's an auto value. Auto leading, which is the default most of the time, means that the amount of space between the lines of text, that leading value, is automatically generated based on how large the type is. So as you make your type larger, that leading value changes size as well. To tighten up this leading, I have to kick it out of auto mode. And to do that, usually what I do is I just grab or type in any number. And now that it's no longer displayed in brackets, it means that I can click in that field and use my up and down arrow keys to adjust that value. The type in our example is white, so I'm going to select all my type by double clicking, pressing Command A. All the text should be selected in that container, and then I'm going to click on paper. Reselect my selection tool and click off to the side just to take a look at how things are shaping up. And I feel that my type is getting a little too close to the edge. So to correct that, I'm going to simply make my text container narrower, and it will allow the text to rewrap within that container. If you're in preview mode right now, let's toggle back to normal mode by pressing W on the keyboard. And again, notice that our container is larger than it needs to be. So we're going to click on the container, right-click, select Fitting, Fit Frame to Content. And you'll notice that there's key commands connected to this, which I use all the time, so you might want to start memorizing that key command sequence. And it should be Option Command C. We're ready for more type, minimize InDesign. This is our last block of copy. We're going to copy it to the clipboard. Go back to InDesign, select our type tool, create a container, and this type sits in a narrow block, and it's aligned with the edge of this type. Press Command V to paste, Command A to select all. I'm going to select the medium weight, and I'm going to make it much smaller. I'm going to try 9 point. And if we take a look at our example, notice that the URL is set in white. So even though this is one block of copy, we're making sure that the URL for this website stands out by moving it to its own line so the URL isn't broken up, and also coloring it differently than the rest of the type. So in order to isolate this URL, have it run on its own line, we're going to place the cursor in front of the word water and press return to force it to a new line. And then we're going to select all the rest of the text, and we want it to run in that gray color that we used originally for the number 32. So we select our text, we make sure that our fill icon is on top in our swatches palette, and click the appropriate swatch. We're going to go ahead and select the URL and click on paper to change that color. This container is bigger than it needs to be for the text that it's holding, so I'm going to use my key command sequence, Option Command C, to automatically resize it. We have our type in place. We're ready to bring in our first graphic. Whenever you want to introduce graphics into an InDesign document, you can't use the Open command because InDesign will only let you open other InDesign documents. In order to introduce a Photoshop file or an Illustrator file, we have to use the Place command. So we're going to go to the File menu and select Place, and notice that there's a key command connected with that, which is well worth memorizing. And if you need to, navigate to your desktop, find the Intro to InDesign folder, and we're going to use the toothbrush.eps. EPS is a format that you usually find vector graphics are saved as. So with that selected, we click Open. Because the graphic is white, we can't really see anything until we click and drag. See that it's a white graphic with a transparent background. When my graphic is selected, it's essentially like having something on a layer in Photoshop in transformation mode. So I can move my cursor to the edge of one of the handles. My cursor should change to that bendy arrow icon, and I can click and drag to rotate. If I start to rotate too quickly, I don't get a preview of how much I'm rotating the graphic inside the container. I just see the edges of the container move. But if I click and hold and wait for a moment, and then click and drag, you can see the preview of that element that's in the container. You're going to take your best guess as to when this graphic is as close to horizontal as possible, and then release. And now that we have our graphic in place, we can scale it up. Taking a look at our example again, the top of the toothpaste and the bottom of the brush pretty much run the same depth as our block of copy. So that's our goal. Whenever we scale something up or down, we always want to make sure that we're not stretching it. To do that, we have to hold our Shift key. We know that already. However, in InDesign, we have the object in the container and the container itself to consider. So what we need to do is we need to hold our Shift key, but we also need to hold our Command key as we click and drag so that both the graphic and the container are transformed. And I'm just going to keep holding my Shift key and my Command key and scaling up until the graphic is about the right size. If it's not exact, don't worry about it. And I'm using my nudge keys just to reposition it in my layout. I'm going to click off to the side, and I'm going to go into preview mode by pressing W just to see how things are looking. Not bad. It's not exactly the same as the example, but if it's anywhere close, then that's in the win column. Ready to add the logo. And again, we need to use the Place command. You never want to copy and paste graphics into InDesign, details to follow. You must use the Place command. So we're going to go to File, Place. We're going to select our logo, Water, Use It Wisely, Open. And now, because our graphic isn't white, we can actually see what it looks like before we place it. And I'm going to click and drag, which allows me to set the initial size of that graphic. I can always change the size of it later, but this at least lets me get close to the size that I want to use it. We definitely want to get rid of the white that's all the way around this logo. And we could open this graphic up in Photoshop and edit it, then re-import it in. But an easier way is to do this. We're going to click to make sure that that container is selected. We're going to go to the Object menu, and we're going to go to Effects, Transparency. And here there's a number of different effects you can apply to objects and elements directly in InDesign. The one we want to focus on is the basic blending mode. Right now it's set to normal, and we're going to select Multiply. And if you have your preview icon selected, you can see immediately the result of that is that it makes all the white disappear. Click OK, and we just saved ourselves a lot of time. I'm going to click on that image again, and I'm just taking a moment to reposition where it is. And as I'm positioning this, I don't want to align the tip of the water drop to my type. I'm looking at the strong line that's created by that square, and I'm trying to approximately align it with the top of the type that it's sitting next to. We've essentially finished our design, or at least we've certainly finished placing all the elements in our design in the correct way. I'm not really happy with the water saving device text and the number 32. It looks just a little too small for the layout, and whenever I try and click on the text, my toothbrush graphic gets selected. And that's because all the objects are on the same layer, and the order that I created the different elements in determines what's on top of something else. So there's a number of different ways we could deal with this, and I think probably what I would do is I would click on my graphic to make sure it's selected. I would click on my background color square, and I would go to my Object menu, select Arrange, and send both to back. Now I can select my text. I'm pretty happy with the way these two pieces of type relate to one another, but I do want them bigger. So rather than double clicking and selecting the type and making it bigger, and then having to go back and make another change to the other piece of type so I can make that larger, I'm going to click on my selection tool, and I'm going to click once on each piece of type so they're both selected, and then I'm going to go to Object and group them together. When they're grouped together, I can move them at the same time, and I can also scale them at the same time. So I don't have to change my point sizes. They'll automatically change for me as I scale these elements up. I'm going to scale them at the same time. I'm going to hold my Shift key to make sure I'm not stretching, and I'm going to hold my Command key so that I'm scaling the container and what's in the container. Click and drag. You should see both things sizing up, but still maintaining the relationship to one another, and then I can easily relocate them somewhere else in my design. Now that we've added all the elements into our design, you're free to make changes and experiment on your own.